it was a fluke. Daryl Greenermeyer calls me up and I said, well, unless you take me to Greenland to help you get the B29, I won't make your headers for your race plane. And I was in. It was literally that quick.
Roger was flying and Daryl was in the co-pilot seat, but there was a really loud beeping, like an alarm, and I was a bit like, shit, what's that?
November 124 Delta Golf. That was the tail number of the Caribou. Okay, in the first episode, they pulled the Keybird out of the lake and, they get started on working on it. And I also want to start to tell you about the characters that are involved in this expedition. And it's not just the guys doing the work. Rick Kriege, Bob Vanderveen, Vernon Rich, Cecelio that was there, of course, Daryl. It's also the Nova crew. There were 4 guys that were there as part of the documentary, the Nova team, to record everything for PBS. Mike Rossiter, a gentleman by the name of Mike Rossiter, was the producer. Albert Bailey was the sound engineer. And then you had 2 cameramen, guy by the name of Noel Smart, and then a younger cameraman, a guy by the name of Lawrence Dodds. I actually got a great opportunity to talk to Lawrence a couple of years ago. And this was right at the start of the pandemic when Zoom was becoming more popular. And he was more than willing to come on camera and answer all my questions, 2 different sessions. So I've got a lot of information from him as well. And of course, like I said in part 1, also from Hunting Warbirds by Carl Hoffman. So we're going to pick up where we left off. And like I said before, I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about what happened during the expedition to recover the Keybird from northern Greenland.
The propellers were badly buckled by the crash, and the main engine bearings were twisted. New ones will be put in their place.
The key elements were the engines, but we've got 4 new engines. We ran 2 of them on the test stand. They ran great.
Now, so Daryl had to get 4 replacement engines. They got to replace all 4 engines. Like you said a few moments ago, all the bearings, during the belly landing, the propellers were still running, spinning. And so when they contacted the snow, the tundra in Greenland, the engines are all twisted and they've been sitting there for 50 years. You can't reuse these things. So instead of trying to rebuild them there, he came up with 4 new engines. Now, according to Bob Vanderveen, who was working with Daryl and Rick Kriege, gathering up all the equipment that they would need for this expedition, they had these 4 radial engines.
They had found 4 engines that were rebuildable since they realized they couldn't use the originals as is. So they had these 4 engines. And Rick, and I was doing help on the engines. He had me, he knew I did some electrical work in my prior life. And he asked if I could rewire these ignition harnesses. And sure, I did all that stuff. They sent the first 2 engines to aircraft cylinder company up in Van Nuys that has the test cells, and they ran 2 of the 4 engines. The 2 engines ran great. One engine had a 50-50 mag drop, and the other one had a 60-40 mag drop. And they told me this is better than minimums that they have. They said these spec'd out very good. When are you going to do the other 2? Now we're just going to ship them as is, and you're not going to test them? They never tested them. They took the engines up with my engine harnesses rewired without being tested, and if they hadn't worked, the mission would have been scrapped because there's no way you could get them going again. There was one ship that goes up once a year. We had to get fuel, we had to get engines, we had to get parts, we had to get everything we needed on that ship and get it up there. So yeah, time was of the essence, and this was a self-funded project, and the cost of running 2 more engines up there and back and testing it would have been high. So he didn't say it, but I'm guessing that's probably one of the reasons they said let's just ship them as is.
They had a deadline. They had to get all of the equipment that they needed, all of the parts, everything for the expedition onto that ship that was going to Thule, and they ran out of time. So now you're going up there with 4 engines, but only 2 that have been tested. And I can't help but wonder, it's like, well, what if something's wrong with the other 2? But then again, if you think about it, they probably had just tremendous faith in their skills and their abilities. Of course they did. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done this. So maybe that's the answer. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments.
We need to get these engines on and tidied up and ready to run, and then hang propellers.
They take an inventory of the work necessary to get the plane airworthy.
The tires, they look good, but they're rayon, and rayon doesn't age well, so we brought up some nylon tires to change them out.
These tires, this particular size of tire, wasn't manufactured anymore. So in order to find replacements, Daryl had to scour basically junkyards. I'm not 100% sure if he went into like the boneyard, like Monthan or anything like that, but these tires, you know, weren't easy. Replacement tires were not easy to find just because they didn't make them anymore. This size wasn't available. It wasn't manufactured anymore. So he really had to, you know, search far and wide for replacement tires. The other thing that I want to say, and, you know, we're all familiar with the documentary. If you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out from, you know, from PBS. But the other thing that I want to say, and it was prevalent in Carl's book, was that this expedition was only supposed to take about 3 weeks. Believe it or not, Daryl thought he could get this done in 3 weeks. And that was the plan. For those of you that have seen the documentary, like me, we know it took a lot longer than that. But the idea was, you know, we're going to get all of this equipment up there. We're going to get 4 engines replaced, and we're going to get this plane in a condition where we can fly it out of there all within 3 weeks before the weather prohibits that kind of thing.
We brought up some nylon tires to change them out. The rudder and the elevators are going to...
Take a look at this image here. So you can see here, the rudder is totally missing. And as they're beginning work on this plane, you know, the rudder is already gone. And I didn't realize that they had already taken the rudder off. Here's Bob, you know, he's going to put his hat on the drum here. But here's the rudder sitting right here. They had pulled it off in 1993 when they went up there to originally evaluate the Keybird and check it out to see if it was salvageable. They had already pulled the rudder off, and you can kind of see in the background there, if you can see my cursor, that it's missing. So fast forward to this point here, they've already removed it. So I'm not exactly sure why they did that, you know, why that was necessary, but I got to believe it was to, you know, figure out, all right, what do we got to do to replace these fabric covered surfaces? Because the fabric covered surfaces were the rudder, the ailerons on the wings, as well as you can see here, Roger, who's at the root of the elevators, those control surfaces on the elevators also fabric covered. So the fabric is just so brittle that, and like he says in the documentary, you could put a finger through it. All of that had to be changed. And that was Bob's job, Bob Vanderveen.
Be changed out. Coming on over here to the ailerons, the control surfaces were fat.
So take a look at this image here. You've got Rick. Rick's right here. That's Daryl. I believe on the right-hand side, that's Cecelio. Then you've got Bob and Roger. This looks like Roger right here. And the Nova crew, of course, is filming this work.
Fabric, and they have to be changed. They were paper thin. You could put your finger right through them.
Here's the Caribou
the summer
again.
here is very short, so time is of the essence. Daryl has a limited budget. He planned to make a round trip in the Caribou every 2 days to fly in the engines and parts from Thule. The weather so far has prevented this. Daryl hoped the whole project could be finished in a month, but 2 weeks have passed. He has yet to fly a single new engine.
I didn't realize, or I totally had forgotten, that they actually specify in the documentary that Daryl thought this could all be done in a month. Like I said, in the book, I believe it was mentioned, 3 weeks. But so, yeah, that was the original goal, in a month. Now, the weather, I don't know, just right there, they totally understated the impact that the weather had. Daryl thought that he could make a run each day, weather permitting, of course, and it hadn't happened. Just days and weeks had gone by, 2 weeks had gone by before some of the other equipment and parts that they needed, like the engines, could even be there. So another thing that I wanted to say, and I should have mentioned this in part 1. You remember when Daryl famously taxis the Caribou around?
Daryl was trying to taxi around. I was out watching, and he got going a little bit, and then nose wheel just went all the way 90. Both
and
tires rolled off,
and
rolled off
famously
the rim, lost all
rips the tire off the nose gear. They got to dig it out. So Rick comes up with the idea
to use
to
propane gas from the camp stove
use
allows
propane
the Caribou
gas
return
to
Thule,
refill
even though the
the tire. And there were a couple of comments from part 1. Why didn't they just use an air compressor to fill it up? They had to have an air compressor. Why wouldn't you have an air compressor? Well, because of the weather, they didn't have the opportunity to fly a lot of their other equipment up there. So an air compressor, I think 2 air compressors actually were part of the equipment list, but the weather prevented them from doing that. So yes, air compressors were part of their equipment, but they had yet to fly them up there. So the only thing that they could think of was the propane. A brilliant idea, but the air compressors just didn't make it up there yet. Okay.
The summer here is very short.
So let's get back to
time
the
is of
Caribou.
essence. Daryl has a limited budget. He planned to make a round trip in the Caribou every 2 days to fly in the engines and parts from Thule. The weather so far has prevented this. Daryl hoped the whole project could be finished in a month, but 2 weeks have passed.
Isn't
He
that
has yet to
arrogant?
fly a single new engine out of Thule.
There's one of the engines that they flew in from California.
We're not exactly.
Captain Dugan, the base manager, asks him about the schedule.
From when you got here, that trying to plan to have
That's
people in
assuming
here.
we could fly straight through, and we haven't been able to.
And I told him, I said, the weather up here is not like, it may be summer, but it's not summer like you think of it in the United States.
Okay. Captain Max Dugan. I have actually traded emails with him. I haven't had an opportunity to interview him yet. He's an interesting guy as well. So he wasn't the base commander, but he was like a logistics commander. And I have traded emails with him. He now has since retired from the Air Force, 30 years later, right? And he runs a travel business out of Michigan. So he has indicated some interest in being interviewed about this. But you got to understand one thing. Daryl's a strong-headed kind of guy. And whatever Daryl wanted to do, Daryl did. And that apparently also lended itself on the Air Force Base, Thule Air Force Base. Bob Vanderveen would share some stories about how the Keybird expedition would borrow base trucks, pickup trucks, to run around and, gather up parts, move things from the loading dock to where the Caribou would land and take off, and they would fail to use the parking brake. The Air Force Base was flat as a pancake, but yet base protocol required anyone to use these trucks to engage the parking brake. And this guy, Max Dugan, Captain Max Dugan, he's the one that had to enforce all these rules. And if you're going to be on the base, you got to follow the base rules. And Daryl and his crew, they just didn't do that. Go. We got to gather up these parts. We got to get the Caribou loaded. We got to put the bulldozer on the Caribou, all this stuff. And Captain Max Dugan's go, whoa, wait a second. We've got rules here. You're not following the rules. And I can't wait to talk to this guy because I want to hear some of these stories. It sounds like they were a major pain in the ass when it came to running around on Thule.
Fly straight through, and we haven't been able to.
And I told him, I said, the weather up here is not like, it may be summer, but it's not summer like you think of it in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. Talk to the man upstairs and do something with this weather, will you?
Well, to get it the same at both sites would be unique also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, the weather up there the last few days has been nice.
Well, that's what I heard. I was gonna say it's good up there, and it hasn't been good
In
here.
fact, it's hot.
So you can kind of see in the background here. What do we got? So you're looking into the Caribou, and you're seeing some miscellaneous parts. Now take a look to Daryl's right. You can see, what the heck is this thing, that they've got going on here? Well, they had to come up with some pretty ingenious methods to rebuild the Keybird, and this is one of them. So keep an eye on that. It's a small part of the story, but I feel it's a very interesting part of the story, is how they came up with methods to get the Keybird into flying condition.
Yeah, it gets actually hot sometimes, like
Yeah.
50 degrees.
Now, no wind.
This is one of them.
Back at the B-29, Rick, Cecelio, and Bob continue working, stripping off the old twisted propellers. Rick designed the hoist from old photos of B-29s being field maintained during the Second World War.
This Caribou is just nothing but trouble. Nothing but trouble.
You had told me the story. I think it was the first time you were on the Caribou. A warning light or something had gone on, and their initial reaction was to pull the fuse.
Yeah, so that was when I went back to Thule on my own. And you had Roger was flying and Daryl was in the co-pilot seat. But there was a really loud beeping, like an alarm, and I was a bit like, shit, what's that? There's an alarm going off. What is that? Is it a fire? What? And then it turned one of them, I can't remember what it turned around, just goes, don't worry about it. It's fine. I was like, oh, okay. Well, it seems quite loud. And then I was seeing him, and then it was Daryl or whatever, was just looking around. He just was like, beep. Okay, that's it. And it stopped. He was good. He's quiet now. Good. Carry on. And I remember thinking, it was quite amazing because obviously I wasn't scared or anything, but I remember thinking typical of them. I wasn't shocked and think, God, what do you mean you're just taking the fuse out? I was a bit like, yeah, that's them.
So look at what they had to do. Someone had made the comment or asked the question in the comments before. We talked about the dozer being offloaded. But when you talk about trying to offload a 5-ton bulldozer, I think it was 5 tons. Don't quote me on that. Well, in Thule, if they couldn't load it because the door couldn't handle the weight, they had to put it up on cribbing and then put it on a trailer, then back the trailer up and all that stuff. Well, then how did they unload it? Well, here you can see how they did it. Look at what they had to do to unload these engines. Okay. So they had to pile up dirt. And because they already had the bulldozer on site, they were, able to do this. But, so the Caribou had to be kind of backed into position to this mound of dirt that they piled up with the bulldozer, and then unload these heavy engines. I'm going to have to look up the weight of these engines, but they were not light. And they had to create this earth ramp to unload these engines onto. Not only unload the engines onto, but support the weight underneath. So once the door would be lowered, follow my cursor here, once the door would be lowered down, then they would bulldoze dirt underneath the ramp to support the weight. People ask, well, what about the bulldozer? If the door wasn't strong enough to handle the weight of the bulldozer at Thule, how did they unload the thing?
Another good story is we had to get the bulldozer out there. Well, when you put the bulldozer in the plane, Daryl really never had figured out how he was going to get the bulldozer in the plane. He knew it would fit, but you couldn't just drive it up the ramp of the plane, go just crush it. So we went out and got a bunch of timbers that were on the base and built a ramp to drive the bulldozer up onto that was the same level as the floor in the back of the plane. And then we put the same timbers underneath the back edge of the bottom of the fuselage. So when the weight of the bulldozer went onto the plane, it loaded the back of where the ramp folded down. And if it was going to crush it at that point, that would be the time to find out. So we managed to get that thing inside the plane, but the blade wouldn't go in there at the same time. So that had to come up on a second trip. But the point of the story is, with a bulldozer in there, it overgrossed the plane by 6,000 pounds. And it was incredible. The plane still just leaped off the ground when it took off. It was just absolutely amazing.
In 1993, when they went up there, they had the Air Force airdrop pallets, aluminum pallets that they used to support the hydraulic jacks, all kinds of stuff like that. And they, in order to distribute the weight of the dozer, they used those aluminum pallets. Apparently that helped them. But you take a look here. Here is one of those, if you can see my cursor, here is one of those aluminum pallets that was flown up from the Air Force base. But they also had to put some dirt underneath the ramp. They did all of that by hand. So just an incredible nightmare. By the way, last thing before I hit play, check out the tail number, November 124 Delta Golf. That was the tail number of the Caribou. And so I was doing some research on what happened to the Caribou. I think that's going to have to be a separate episode. But anyone that's interested in researching the Caribou, tail number, November 124 Delta Golf.
Daryl and Roger return with a new engine, and the old ones are slowly eased off.
I always thought it was kind of cool. Each engine had its own name. This one was Ida.
Go forward.
Before the new engines can be installed, a lot of components need to be stripped from the old ones.
Okay. So how do you want to dismantle this thing? Well, first we got to take the carburetor, take all.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. I wish I could find Cecelio Grande. I don't know where he is. I don't know what nationality he is. But I wish I could find this guy. If anyone knows where he might be. Or Cecelio, if you're watching these videos, please get in touch with me. Ken at historyxchannel.com. I would love to talk to you.
This stuff off. Then we got to take the injection pumps off. Then we got to take the carburetor off. Okay. And then we take the motor mount off.
Rick Kriege was a guy that Daryl had made a deal with the Marine Corps to trade one plane for another plane. And the plane that he was flying back to Quantico broke down in Tulsa. And he had to, I forget what needed to be done, but there was some pretty a major component needed to be replaced, and what's it called, the Spartan Aeronautics School there. And he went over there and said, "Hey, do you have anybody that can come help me do this?" And Rick Kriege volunteered as one of the students, and he helped him work on the plane. So that's where Rick came from. Rick was a badass from Wyoming. He was worked in the oil field and thought that there's a better life out there. So he was going to become an airplane mechanic. So he went to that school, and then he and Daryl became good friends. And then Rick went to work for Daryl. But, Rick could do anything. And he was the smallest guy on the crew, but in a bar fight, he would be the guy you'd want to back you up. Tough guy. Good guy.
Eventually, a small production line is set up as old engines are dismantled to be taken back to Thule.
So you can see here, this right here, you've got the crane that Rick designed in order to take it all apart. But you take a look here. Here is one of those, if you can see my cursor, here is one of those aluminum pallets that was flown up from the Air Force base. So they were, in the beginning, the Air Force base was very cooperative with the effort to recover the Keybird. As time went on, and as Daryl kind of wore out his welcome, yeah, they were not so easy to work with, because Daryl wasn't easy to work with. But again, talking about those aluminum pallets, here's one of those right here.
And the new ones are made ready to be hoisted into place on the old engine mountings.
Now, here's another thing. Look how the weather has changed. Let me rewind. Here you can see they're in jackets. They're in coats. Bob, this is Bob Vanderveen right here. You know, you can tell Bob because he's got his big furry hat. So they're in jackets, but you know, the weather's pretty good. Now, as they've started to rebuild these engines, you know, they fly in a new engine and they take all of the old components, oil pumps, that type of thing, and put them on. Now look at what the weather's like now.
And the new ones are made ready to be hoisted into place
Look,
on the old
now,
engine mount.
I think that's Daryl up there. I think that's Daryl. He's all bundled up. He's in a fur-lined jacket. He's got this hat on. The weather is getting colder. Like I said earlier, 3 to 4 weeks. That was it. And that schedule's been totally blown out the window. So they had to get more help. And we're going to get into that in a second.
The engines themselves are massive 18-cylinder radials, the most powerful ever built. Changing these huge engines in a warm hangar is difficult enough. Doing it in the middle of the Arctic will be a backbreaking
It's getting a
task.
lot colder. A lot colder. Oh, and you can hear that air compressor in the background, can't you? So they did have air compressors, just
Rick
not
is
in the
tireless,
beginning.
and his workload isn't only
Now,
confined to the B29.
this is obviously from earlier. You know, the Nova crew, they're piecing things together. And you know what? Now might be a good time to talk about the Nova crew, because there were 4 of them, like I said. Mike Rossiter, Albert Bailey, Noel Smart, and Lawrence Dodds. And as time went on, and they realized, hey, look, this isn't going to be done in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks. It's getting colder. They started to press the Nova crew to get some of the work done. And I want to share with you some of the memories that Lawrence Dodds had about doing some of this work.
Out of the whole group, I think it would have been Vernon that I would have had the most connection, the most bit of fun chat backwards and forwards. We might take the mickey out of each other, the piss out of each other a little bit, and I think we had a sort of more of a connection than anyone. So yeah, I kind of I used to talk to him quite a bit, if I remember.
When they asked you guys to help, or you guys volunteered to help, was Vernon the type that said, hey, I need you to do this, and here's why? Did he explain to you what they were trying to do, or was it just, hey, hold this while we do this?
No, he's pretty informative, and he would let you know what the end game was and why you would do something, and he even might teach you. I remember I was doing some riveting, and I'm sure it was him. It might have been Rick, actually, well, one of them, exactly what you should do with the metal to get it tight and to keep the, you know, have a little bit of to be taught some basic stuff. Yeah, why not? Yeah, very helpful.
When you're working on this plane with those guys, did you ever see anything or form any thoughts like, oh, this thing's not going to get off the ground?
Yeah, I do, because I remember, I think we might have been shooting, but it was just Noel and myself. Maybe we were just getting some cutaway shots of the cockpit or the navigator's bit, or the guy with all the dials that faces the other way. We were probably just getting a collection of shots inside the plane, but we were on our own. And I remember that quite vividly, because it was great just to have the silence and being there together and talk about it. And I remember saying to him, I remember sitting in that chair, I think I mentioned, in the engineer's chair with all the dials, thinking, Jesus Christ, is this, you know, and there's headphones there and the dials, and actually thinking and trying to imagine you could actually sit in that seat facing the other way in this thing and think that he's going to fly was quite unbelievable to me. When you sit in that B29, when it's on the ground, and you sit in either the, you know, the pilot seat or the co-pilot seat, you're not looking straight, you're kind of looking up to the sky, and then you see the glass dome, and the very primitive controls. And whether you're a pilot or not, you just think, is it possible that you can actually sit in this chair and fly this machine? It's quite, I remember thinking this just incredible, amazing.
The Caribou also presents problems.
So I keep saying it over and over and over. The Caribou was a nightmare. The Caribou kind of became its own character in this documentary. This photograph before shows that every time it went back to Thule, there was something that needed to be fixed. Here in this picture, you could see oil leaks. You could see oil leaks that they would constantly have to address.
The Caribou takes off on its third trip to Thule.
Look, here you can see, look, they're pretty much surrounded. They're surrounded by hills and mountains. So every time they had to take off, you know, they had to taxi to the very end of the runway and maximize their takeoff
takes off
distance.
On its third trip to Thule.
Because they're surrounded. It's like a fishbowl. There's Cecelio.
It circles and returns to land. Roger thinks there may be an engine fire.
As soon as I went to cruise power, the light came on and it was flashing. And I went back and looked at the engine. You know, I didn't see any smoke or anything, but you know, I was reading in a book where they said you can get some fires internally with no smoke evidence. So we thought it was prudent to come back where the maintenance is.
I wanted, in talking to Lawrence Dodds, he had some definite impressions about Roger and his capabilities.
I was wondering if Roger was more of a by the book kind of a person.
I think he was, because that was his job, and I'm sure it would have been very hard not to be like that for him. He seemed to be a very cool and collected, measured man, if I remember. Really, a nice fella, really nice fella, very nice. There was something about him. He was from Texas, wasn't he? He had that Texan swagger. Yeah, I remember Noel and I thought he was a class act right from the word go. I think he was quite high up in United Airlines, and I think he was a training captain. So not only was he a captain, but he was a training captain. So I don't think you can get higher than that within the industry of whichever airline you were working for at the time.
You can see here, you know, Rick's just thinking, it's like, oh, what a nightmare, you know. It's like, can I just give me one thing to work on, not four, and least of all, make it the Caribou, right? But the Caribou was sucking up so much of his time and energy. And if you look at his face here, you can kind of tell he's already exhausted. And he might not have been letting on, but he was already dealing with back issues, tremendous amount of pain.
Rick discovers that the fire indicator on the engine is faulty. The abortive flight has cost Darrell more time.
It's really disappointing. What can I say? I mean, it's here we got 2 beautiful days of weather coming up, and we got plenty of work to do, but it's just gonna, you know, if we can't take off on Monday, then we are behind. We're gonna have people sitting on their hands doing nothing.
Then the weather causes more delay. A month has passed, and it is now the second week of August. Snow is beginning to settle ominously on the surrounding hills.
And when it comes to the weather and the snow, like I said, they were only supposed to be there 3-4 weeks tops. And for those of us that have been exposed to camping and everything, they went up there with regular tents, sleeping bags, nothing that was geared up or designed to handle temperatures, you know, that would lend itself to snow creeping in towards the camp. So they quickly realized that they were kind of unprepared. What a miserable place.
Rick and Cecelio keep working even in the rain. hammering on the exhaust cowlings.
Look at him. He's lying there in the mud. He must have been freezing.
Well, that was easy. Whose side are you on? You got any of those bolts? Have you heard a report from the CASA on the tops of the clouds? And also, is it scattered or broken back at Thule?
It's broken back here. And scattered 1.7.
Darrell is desperate to keep the shuttle flights going and feels that he has to risk flying in bad weather.
So don't bother going that direction.
Okay, I guess we'll give it a shot. We'll come around and then we'll try and come in under it.
Okay, come down with it. Let's go ahead and go back up with it again.
So in 1993, and we talked about this in part 1, they were able to obviously had to get the plane onto its landing gear so that they could check out the engine, and try and get one started. We talked about that in part 1. And you can see here is one of the hydraulic jacks that they brought up in 1993. They strapped them to the skids of the Huey helicopter that they flew up there. In talking about the Caribou definitely became a bottleneck, right? Mechanical problems, but the Caribou wasn't supposed to be the only method they had of shuttling things back and forth. They also had a Huey helicopter as well. And the helicopter ran into mechanical problems. And Vernon Rich, who was at Thule, he's the one that bled the propane out of the tire and refilled the tire with air. While they're working on stripping down the engines and making these changes, Vernon Rich was back at Thule trying to get the Huey helicopter operational. He wasn't supposed to stay at Thule. He was supposed to be up at the Keybird site helping them work. So not only are they, dealing with weather issues, they were supposed to have another man up there helping them with this work. And so things just weren't working out the way they thought.
Let's go ahead and go back up with it again.
So in 1993, they lowered everything. They lowered the landing gear. Once they jacked up the plane, they lowered the landing gear down by hand. It was actually hand cranks. But now they've got to get the hydraulics working to once you take off in the Keybird, you've got to be able to retract the landing gear. And that's what they're working on right now. There he is. So there's Vernon in the background, in the green. Rick's up front. So at this particular point, they had given up on the Huey helicopter. Can't be repaired. I don't know if they didn't have the right parts. I remember reading that Vernon, when he started working on the Huey, realized it's a lot more complex of a piece of equipment than what he was used to working on. And so they had to give up and just strictly put all their eggs in one basket, namely the Caribou.
He turned it on and off. Turn on again.
There's Bob.
The work is physically demanding. Removing the old tires takes hours, even using the bulldozer to separate them from the rim.
I mean, breaking the bead off of a tire, is key to being able to change a tire. But they had to use the blade of the bulldozer to break the bead of the tire off of the rim. There are two different there's a kind of rim that can be bolted in two sections. And obviously these rims weren't like that. So they had to break the bead off and and change the tire that way.
Removing the old tires takes hours, even using the bulldozer to separate them from the rim.
And then they got to pull the tube out.
Hey, Bob. Now.
He's getting frustrated. Big time frustrated.
Small one.
He just looks exhausted.
Rick is beginning to show the strain of this hard work. Looks exhausted.
And here they're kind of foreshadowing. Most of us have seen the documentary. We know what happens to this guy, but you can tell the editing, the PBS Nova, they're starting to foreshadow what happens to Rick.
Mealtimes bring some respite and are an opportunity to tell stories of old exploits, like the time Daryl tried to...
Okay, so Bob Vanderveen, one of the first people to reach out to me when I started creating videos about the Keybird, and it's pretty cool. So he had a restaurant, show you a picture of it here, the Ramona Grill in Ramona, California, and here he's wearing one of his T-shirts.
Here's my restaurant. That's where I first bumped into them. It's kind of funny. We smelled the solvent in their clothes. As a kid, I used to see him racing at Reno. I saw him there, and I go, "Hey, you look like Daryl Greenemeyer." And Rick says, "That's because he is." I said, "You guys need any help? I'd love to play around here and work on some of this stuff." I probably volunteered to work with him for something short of a year. I was probably 2 months, maybe 3 months before we actually went on the recovery operation that they asked me if I wanted to go. Rick asked me. I think he asked me 2 or 3 times. Maybe Daryl asked me once or twice.
As Bob tells the story, he approaches Bob and says, "Hey, we're doing this expedition to go into Greenland." And Bob's thinking, it's like, "Hey, do you want me to help?" And Daryl says, "No, we want you to cook."
At the dinner we had at Daryl's house just before we left, he had a big dinner with everybody there. And that's when they asked me if I wanted to cook. Oh, Christ, I knew that was coming.
He worked on calorie count. He worked on what kind of food. Did anyone have any kind of restrictions? Was anyone a vegetarian?
I just wanted to get some hot chow in their stomach and keep them going for a month. I began to put a menu together, asking my food suppliers for donations, whatever they can donate. I had to kind of guess how many people we're going to have and how many meals a day and how many days we're going to be there. And I came up with some menu ideas. I bounced them off of Daryl and I showed them to Mike, and then we said, "Okay, this is what I can come up with. Is that going to work for you?" They said, "It looks great." Ham was one of the best things. Got a guy that donated a bunch of New York steaks. Unfortunately, there was one gentleman, the sound recordist, Albert. Yeah. It turned out he was a Muslim. Mike Rossiter, the director of the Nova Crew, he didn't tell me the guy was Muslim until I actually got up there. And I can't eat pork.
Mealtimes bring some respite and are an opportunity to tell stories of old exploits, like the time Daryl tried to take off in Panama without using the runway.
They wanted me to take off on the ramp so they didn't have to open up the fence to get on Panama property to use the runway. So I said, "Well, no problem." But then they wanted me to take off a little bit downwind, because if I went the other way, I'd be flying over the general's house. Okay. And so I said, "Well, okay, I think so." It was a downhill run and then a slight...
Obviously, Rick in the foreground, Vernon in the background. So at this particular point, you can see the weather is getting really, really cold. They're all bundled up in this tent and, looking like they got plenty to eat at this particular point. But Vernon, with his head cover on right here is pretty cold.
And then a slight turn about 60 knots. and then down the ramp.
How much runway do you have all told?
I don't remember, but what happened was I went down a little hill and made the right turn, and then it started bouncing, and all of a sudden the nose wheel steering kicked out, and I tried to hold it, and I was too close to the fence, and so it kind of lifted off and then squatted right down on the fence. But I didn't give up just then. I kept going.
Working under the wing of that snowstorm, it was too hot. It was coming loose because of that.
Oh, really?
Bob has finished recovering the rudder with fabric, and he and Roger are now putting the finishing touches to it. Vernon has to make many of the small components for the rudder cables and control surfaces from scratch. Without blueprints, it is not easy.
So one of the reasons Vernon was on this expedition, Daryl had come across Vernon because of his machining capabilities, his expertise when it came to manufacturing aviation parts.
You know, it was a fluke. A real good friend of mine, Mike Dillon, was sitting in his office one day, and Daryl Greenemeyer calls on the speakerphone and said, Mike, there's a guy in Scottsdale somewhere that built the headers for the Nemesis Formula One plane, and I want him to help me work on my unlimited plane that I'm going to take to Reno. And I knew who it was on the phone. I said, Mike, tell that guy that I won't do anything for him. And he said, well, why not? I said, well, unless you take me to Greenland to help you get the B29, I won't make your headers for your race plane. And he laughed. So a couple of days later, the phone rang, and Daryl Greenemeyer calls me up and says, do you really want to go? And I said, yes. And I was in. It was literally that quick. And the rest is history. So it was quite a fluke.
These planes, these Warbirds, you know, they're antiques. And in order to restore them, you have to just recreate these things, like they say, often without blueprints. And that's one of the reasons why Vernon Rich, right here in the blue now, is there. He was just a master at doing, you know, improvising when it came to, you know, machining replacement parts.
In its place, and then drill this one out and stick it in the other end. So we'll have the same configuration.
Just like we made the other two.
Well, you just, yeah, except that, no,
it doesn't look like they, right. It doesn't look like they're showering much. So I can only imagine what things smelled like.
Just like new again.
There's Bob.
They'll fly.
Let's see. So here's Bob and his hat. Roger helping Bob when Roger wasn't flying the Caribou or in bad weather. He was helping Bob recover the control surfaces. And so in addition to the cooking, that was going to be Bob's contribution, was recovering the control surfaces with this replacement fabric.
This is the real recovery work here.
it'll fly.
You bet it'll fly.
Now, they had, you know, we talked about they had removed the rudder in 1993. Now it's recovered. Take a look at how they do it.
By the time the rudder is ready to be hoisted back into place, the project has taken 5 weeks.
5 weeks.
Far longer than Daryl's original forecast.
Check this out. Remember that piece that was sitting in the back of the Caribou? That literally was their scaffolding supports, and they've pieced them together, and Rick has climbed up this, you know, they pieced some scaffolding supports together, and that's what he's kind of using as a ladder to get the rudder back in place. Yeah, so that's what that component was sitting in the Caribou.
Why don't you give me that?
Look at that. There he is. There's a close-up view of it.
But the sun is now back, and people's spirits have lifted again.
I'm gonna try and figure out how how high up in the air he is, because he's at the highest point of the B-29 bomber, which was a pretty big plane. So how high up was he? If anyone knows, put it in the comments.
All right.
Now they got the elevators.
Beautiful. Stick a bolt in there and I'll wiggle it around.
Can you tap it in?
Watch, I'm gonna try to do now. Well, you see the flange in front? It's got to be straight with this. I mean, in the back of the flange. See, it's a flat spot.
Yeah, I see the flat spot.
Well, it isn't lined up.
Oh, it isn't.
It's going.
Yeah, it is.
Right there.
Now in the background, you can hear the air compressor, or possibly a generator. They also had a couple of generators. Every time you see Roger working, helping them out with the Keybird, that's Roger not flying the Caribou, because of bad weather, low cloud ceiling, whatever. Or maybe the Caribou needed to be repaired. Anytime you see Roger in the documentary, it's not a good sign, because Roger was not supposed to be helping them rebuild the plane. He was supposed to be making parts runs in the Caribou.
Yeah, it is.
Right there.
Same with Daryl, by the way. Yeah, Daryl.
Are you crying? Are you so happy with us?
Daryl wasn't really supposed to be, the plan was Roger and Daryl were supposed to be making these shuttle runs. So whenever you see Daryl and Roger working on the Keybird, that's not the way the plan was supposed to go.
Tears of joy.
You got it.
The weeks of work are paying off. The rudder's been fitted and 4 new engines are in place. The last major job is the propellers.
The propellers came out of the prop shop in Tucson, and they've been overhauled, but they haven't been final assembled yet. We'll put those together and hang them on. But I don't anticipate any problem with that. I've done that before, and they usually go together pretty easy. These are awful big propellers, so the biggest I've ever dealt with.